Hello, everybody. Today is January 12th, 2023, and this is the OLM issue triage and working group. On our agenda today, we are going to do a quick announcement just saying that OLM v23.1 is now released and available for use upstream. And we are going to continue with the OLM v2 milestone 2 generation. Before we proceed, is there anything else we want to cover in this meeting? Anyone have any suggestions? Okay, so we'll hit the first one. As I said in the introduction, we've got a new upstream release. It's 0.23.1. You'll notice that we had a very recent 0.23.0 release. We had to pull that one back because of some changes made to the catalog source, which ran it in restricted mode. The upstream manifest for the community catalog source wasn't updated to use the restricted format, so it was failing to deploy the community catalog source. And this upstream release basically just consists of a single difference from the 0.23.0, which just makes it so that the community catalog runs successfully. So if faced with the choice of using 23.0 versus 23.1, please use the latest version. Okay. Cool. So what we're going to do today is continue to go down the list of possible topics for milestone 2. In our last meeting, we discussed defining the distribution process early on. We discussed defining the DEPI source API, removing DEPI's hard reliance on the registry v1 client into an adapter, and then working with some of the work that ONIC is doing to showcase how the next generation of the catalog source API could tie into the DEPI source. And that would like basically proof of concept that the DEPI source adapter is working as intended. And the third thing we were considering is deciding how OLM is going to facilitate upgrades of operators that it installs. All right, so we're going to continue going through the remaining comments. And each new idea, we'll talk about it. We'll try to prioritize it in this list as we go through, and eventually we will get through every item and we'll be ready to define what milestone 2 is going to consist of. Okay, so we already talked about the upgrade experience. That's currently ranked number 3. The next item that we didn't discuss was supporting more constraints in the operator API. So let's discuss that. Currently, the operator API only allows you to define the package name constraint. This obviously isn't going to be the final version of the API. What this story would basically consist of, if we chose to throw this in milestone 2, is saying, you know, we could start with the version range. That would be really easy. We could say, like, I'm going to create an operator with a constraint of v1, and it's going to be filled by a entity in the catalog source, and that catalog source happens to have both versions v1 and v2. And instead of defaulting to v2, we default to v1. That seems, you know, like being able to pin a version or even declaring a range is pretty useful. My guess is that this is probably lower on priority than the 3 items we've already discussed. I'm going to open it up to the group to convince me why we need to have it higher on the list, or if we're all okay setting this story where we introduce more constraints to the operator API. If we put it as number 4, I'm fine with that too. Anybody feel strongly one way or another?
I guess I would say that some of these proposals here really only make sense when you have the ability to actually update, right? So things like version range pinning or the ability to ignore the graph, it really only comes into play when you start to pivot from one version to another. So it kind of feels odd that we would, you know, do that before we actually have the ability to do simple pivots between an older version and a newer version.
So I don't know that I necessarily agree. And the reason for that is from an implementation perspective. Well, I will say that this list of things, these constraints, I think it'd be interesting for us to spend some time coming up with a mechanism or the like sort of what we imagine the spec of the operator API is going to look like with that set of selection constraints will look like, but probably implementing a set of those or even maybe all of those at the same time is probably not a heavy lift, because in my head, the interface is the hard part more than the actual implementation of generating the constraints from the resolver, since those bits already kind of exist. But that, I think, is very separate from what's the end user value. Like, I don't know that there necessarily is a whole lot more end user value from us defining how you can define the constraints if I want to install this specific version versus just give me any old version from this package. Beyond the potential for, I guess, upgrade, but even then, like, you're going to want to be able to install some specific version and never upgrade it too, right? So I guess my point is that, like, from a technical perspective, I think implementing the constraint interface first seems like a valuable goal on the path towards eventually defining an upgrade mechanism. And I'd like to put the upgrades themselves probably out of scope, because that seems like it could potentially be a much bigger and different thing.
Then I just wonder how you would test it, right? So I can see the channel constraint. That's something we need when we install the operator. The version range pinning, as well as the ability to ignore the upgrade path, like, I kind of find it hard to even think about how we would demo that without the ability to actually see an upgrade or see an upgrade being prevented.
Well, I mean, just trivially, right? Like right now, the the concept of resolution is the same as the concept of selecting which bundle you're going to install based on the input. So I could very easily imagine a situation where adding channel to the list of constraints, or adding a version range, or even a specific version, is something you might want to do when you want to say, hey, when I install this operator, I only want it to be installed from stable. So get me whatever that is. Or same thing, I only want it to be in the 2.x range of versions. And, you know, I would say maybe putting the ignore upgrade graph bullet point out of scope might make it more clear kind of what the difference between those two things is. But the how do I resolve for a specific installation is relevant the first time and also on upgrade. So I think focusing on that piece of it is just kind of separate from upgrade, at least outside the scope of, like, how would this be valuable for an end user? If that, does that make sense?
So
yeah,
just
I guess I'm still confused about the range pinning, sort of what the use case for that is. I totally buy the channel constraint. Version range pinning, I kind of put in the bucket of what happens when a constraint is resolved on my operator, and it would cause my operator to update. The version range would kind of define the maximum version I'm willing to run in order to satisfy someone else's constraint. Maybe I'm misunderstanding that.
Well, it's not just that, right? Like, you can imagine putting a version range as greater than equal to 2.0.0 less than 3.0 when you first install. In which case, what that'll do is it'll make a selection for you of a version 2.x.x.
I would have a hard time understanding a user situation where you would want to do that, like in isolation of anything else.
I mean,
might be
well, I think that's why I'm kind of saying, like, let's put the user experience out of the conversation here, because I think where that does become very valuable, you're right, is in the context of upgrades, because that's functionally equivalent to, I want to kind of define my own subset of upgrade channel so that I can say, I only want Z-stream updates for some specific minor version. And as long as the edges are there, you can find them. But that, like I said, that's the selection mechanism, I think, still has to be, from a technical perspective, diverged from the upgrade. I think it's really going to be important for us when we're doing this that we don't try to treat the operator API as another subscription API, because I don't think we've even had a conversation yet about the mechanism for upgrade. And I think tying all that together is probably going to lead us down the wrong path.
Yeah, so I've been trying to think of this bullet point as more of a way of saying, like, how can I constrain the set of stuff that I'm saying you can install when I create an operator CR? And if you frame that from an engineering perspective, we know we need channels. We know we're eventually going to need some type of version range ability. Forcing a version, I think, is a little bit, this whole forcing concept probably requires some more conversation. And like no depths also requires some conversation. But I think saying that, I think it's very easy with a fake catalog source that consists of some entities with versions and channels to test these two features. And when I say features, I mean the ability to constrain, like, what can be installed to fulfill an operator CR. And so that'd be, maybe we, like, for a first round iteration, we propose just introducing the channel constraints and the version range constraints for the operator API.
So another interesting thing that kind of popped up via the conversation that Kevin and Daniel was having is, so I see where Daniel is coming from, right? Like when I do sudo DNF install a package, I typically, if I want something, then I'll probably have the ability to pin a version that I want installed particularly, right? I don't mention a range. And that's probably what Daniel is trying to say. But then Kevin said that, okay, the UX part of it has to be left out of the conversation. And that is interesting to me, because then what exactly is the operator API? Because I was under the impression that the operator API is the user facing API that users are going to be interacting with. But then if we are saying that, no, we're going to be having all of this plumbing that our underlying components will need.
Sorry,
then,
I'm not saying, go ahead.
No, yeah, so I was just going to finish my thought by saying that it sounds like, at least from my end, I'm still confused about what the operator API is going to be. Is it going to be UX, or is it going to be another of our underlying APIs that users are not going to be interacting with?
Sorry, I'm not saying we should ignore the UX. What I'm saying is we should separate the UX of specifying constraints to the selection problem of how do I pick which package to install, from how do I define what the upgrade process is. And almost certainly the actual upgrade lifecycle will be tied to what those constraints are and how they're defined, but that the actual mechanics of doing an upgrade probably come at a different time in terms of implementation. That's all I'm saying. Like, I'm saying that that install and upgrade are the exact same problem if you look at it from the perspective of everything you do for a selection is a constraint. So like implementing the how do I select for and define those constraints is separate from how do I actually implement a real upgrade mechanism.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree with you, Kevin. I think separation absolutely in order. I guess the order in which we tackle these issues and eventually provide customer or user value, that's kind of where I think the rub is. So we just established that, yeah, wide channels are useful. Version range pinning is probably not going to be useful. We know we need it at some point. But as we are talking about what do we need to do next as another milestone for making this whole V1 concept in UX go forward. Is version range pinning really going to have any impact on that? Or, for instance, a way to update?
You could
I can think
imagine
of
that the trivial version of version range pinning is my version range is version equals 1.2.3. Right. And if you implement version range as the same as selecting for a specific version, then the difference between those two implementations is a no op. At the end of the day, we have to translate that into SAT. So
yeah, I guess I see where you're coming from. It's kind of falls out of that whole concept. Like if you do a super simple constraint, like I need version X, you might just as well do I need min version X and max version Y. I can see that. I was just wondering, like that's, you know, it's probably a no up as you say, but that's not over focused on that particular use case of have range right now, because with the abilities that we have right now, nobody's going to use that. Like it's unless we think we are onto a feature here that we might not have considered, that we essentially ask people to emulate today by arranging their channels a certain way. So if we had a way to use this as a update policy of sorts that says, well, there are multiple major version releases and minor version releases and patches all in one large channel called stable, that version range might actually help implement and update policies where a customer that's more careful about what you want to do in the production cluster, but still wants to get some sort of over-the-air automation updates, will be able to say, I want something from the 2.1.x product line. And that would kind of alleviate the need to arrange channels this way. Would that be something that we could make use of this? Because then I think it has even more tangible value in the milestone too.
Yeah, I also have a feeling that we are probably having this conversation because of the way this point is laid out, because I see the point that, okay, we've got all the components like DEPI ready to be plumbed, but then we need a controller to tie all of that together. And that's where the version range mentioning during upgrades come of use. But then operator API is something that we're looking at as a user-facing UX. So that's why I think Daniel's point is, what is the point of having that in the operator API? And it sounds like this is also as a result of us trying to kind of mush in the subscription and the CSV APIs together, where the subscription controller was responsible, had the dependency resolver and was responsible for calculating upgrades from, you know, version ranges and all that stuff. But then we had the CSV installed to indicate a specific pinned version of an operator. So it sounds like there's a lot of context kind of crammed into this point.
I would also just add that I think version range, there's other use cases where this could be useful. Many operators are released in a like their version matches the version of the software that they manage, right? So like you can imagine like etcd operator v2 manages etcd v2, and then if there was a v3, there'd be etcd operator v3 manages all the minor and patch versions for etcd v3. And I could be a user that knows I don't want to use etcd v3, I want to use etcd v2, and there's absolutely no way that I can do that without version range pinning if they're all in the same channel. And so if I'm not a catalog source maintainer, I can't install v2 today because we would default to the latest version, which would be v3. And so something I would like to propose is taking this first bullet point, and instead of just having this top level thing supporting more constraints in the operator API, instead refactor it or this proposal so that we're saying, we could reach consensus on the basic format for how we're going to allow people to specify constraints in the operator API. And the first two types of constraints we're going to support in this new format are channel and version ranging. And I think these two other bullet points should probably be moved into their own thing, i.e. fully define what it means to force an operator install, because I think some people will have different opinions on what that looks like. And then we also have to kind of figure out our dependency default experience for milestone 2 before we can even do this one. So I'd like to move those two out and kind of refactor this one. Does that seem reasonable for now?
I think that makes a lot of sense, Alex. This is kind of the point I was getting at, but I think you said it in a much better way, which is like, I'm just not that concerned yet with what the life cycle of these things are, because we're not at a point where we can even have the flexibility to define what it is that we want to install. So I think channel and version range is a reasonable set of things to use as an example for that. But I think you're right that like ultimately the goal, it's not that the goal here is to enable a user to specify a channel or to enable a user to specify a version range. It's to define the mechanism on the spec of the operator API to define constraints with those as examples.
Yeah, and I totally agree with Daniel's point that these two just don't make sense right now. And
Yeah,
like,
yeah, I agree. Like the fourth one, I almost think is like, we probably want to start off with that almost being the default. Like we probably don't even want to worry about the dependency problem to start, because that's just added complexity, and like adding in conceptual dependency constraints like that could almost come later.
So Daniel, if we refactor this and pull these two, these two top restraints out and refocus it on defining what the user experience is going to be in terms of how they define constraints and updating the spec to open that portal, and then we capture these elsewhere, are you okay with that?
Yeah. So I think I was just getting hung up on the version range thing. I think the version itself, even if it's just one scalar value, that totally makes sense. And if that is kind of engineering technically the same effort as also supporting a range or just a min or just a max version, yeah, I totally get it. I didn't see it from that perspective. And Anik, to your point, I do think operator API is totally about UX, and I think that's the thing that we should aim people to be the main interaction point with the whole V1 experience from an admin, at least. So I don't think we want to like confuse or like separate concepts, that people think about it in one object or one kind of problem area into separate APIs that we had before. So like my point is definitely keep this in operator API. Just one thought that I had while you were talking about how to refactor the statement here. I think like it almost sounds like you are suggesting to build a UX where there's a generic spec constraints list, and in that list you list constraints with generic operators and generic operands, and you kind of have a little almost a parsing of a constraint language going on. I think that this should not prevent us from having an idea around, well, there's maybe a property called spec channel, right? That's just one constraint. And then there's this property called spec version, and maybe that's a single value, or it can be a dictionary, or it can be a list, I don't know. But let's not make this like a generic, all kinds of constraints in the universe thing in one like large field that is super hard to maintain and understand for a beginner.
Yeah,
so
and just
my only saying is keep the UX for beginners in mind when you design it.
Yeah, and to Daniel's point, many people rely. So this is something that is going to come out as we like, like some acceptance criteria is, like actually defining how these. Sorry, I'm gonna write this, defining how the operator CR spec may define, how new constraints can be added to the operator CR spec, right? Like that's what you're getting at. And like some information that we'd have there is like, can you find out about all the supported constraints with OC explained would be like, or sorry, kubectl.
Let's juggle there a little bit. Yeah, something like that. I guess my advice is keep the design goal of lower the cognitive load of the user in mind as well. Like the user doesn't come in and say, I want to know about all the constraints, right? That's not a thing. The user will come in and say, how can I install an operator? And how can I choose the operator version that I want, right? So it's a little bit more specific than just generically what are all the constraints, which could be a lot of things, right? But yeah, eventually, it would be nice if they could say kubectl explain, and they'll see the fields and they will read the description of those and go, oh, this is how I select the general, or this is how I select the version. These are constraints that people kind of have in mind all the time, right?
And one other thing I want to point out is that Pear has played around with the idea of allowing, maybe we won't go into this, but I know Pear has talked about how DEPI, like users could provide types of constraints that they support. I'm not really sure how this would necessarily work with OC. I suppose the only constraints we have to support are the ones that we support. And so we don't worry about user constraints, but I'm curious where that all fits in. I'd have to wrap my head around that space. So maybe as a follow-up, how does the bowl
Yeah, I guess what you are getting at is that the operator API, or let's say the user input at that point in time where somebody decides I want an operator, that's possibly not the only source of constraints that you need to take into account. But this may go a little bit too far for the discussion here.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think this is a conversation we've had a lot with the old version of OLM. I don't know. I don't think we should put in scope a generic constraint system as arbitrary input. Like I that feels like a complex thing for us to solve for. I guess more what I'm interested in is like I think there should definitely be some stuff in the spec that is these very obvious like bundle selection constraints that define simple things like I want this package, I want this version, I want this set of versions, I only want to install from this upgrade channel. But that we should make sure as we're coming up with the concept for that spec that we at the very least explore the complexity of things like cluster constraints, of dependency constraints, of I only want to install this operator if it's compliant with FIPS kind of constraints. Like those arbitrary sort of constraints are going to be something that we're going to have to look at some point in the future. But I don't think that we need to start there. We just need to make sure that when we define the spec, it's flexible enough that we can extend it.
Where are we capturing? So what you mentioned, Kevin, is let's start with A, but also make sure we keep in mind the remaining stuff, which is B. So where are we capturing that B? Do we have a specific place in the project where we are capturing these? I think we've talked about here are the things that we must also look at before we, GA and stuff like that.
I think the problem of arbitrary constraints is a very complex one that I don't know we could just go write a doc for in an hour. I would maybe call it out as something we need to put out of scope here. But I don't necessarily know if we want to start with attempting to even describe that problem in depth.
Yeah, no, I'm not.
Oh, go ahead.
I'm not suggesting that. I'm just suggesting that what you said is what I agreed with, that at some point, so then 95% of the users will be happy with spec.channel or spec.version. But then the 5% of users who do come up with these I only want bundles that are, that have this property, those were the problem in V0 for us, where we had to jump through hoops to implement that. And that makes generic constraint specification. It was the sole reason we were thinking about like introducing cell go language for generic constraints and stuff like that. So I was suggesting that we at least capture a point that we'll think about generic constraints somewhat later in a later milestone. I'm not suggesting we think about it in this milestone.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Some of this is also in Jira, right? So if you look at the Jira epics for extension constraints, it'll have these user stories that are behind those asks of generic constraints that are laid out on the cluster as well. So if you go look at OCPBU 112, this is the Jira entry we have for this. That's where this is captured. We'll probably need a better way to kind of make this more public or make it part of GitHub. But as we are, working on this and looking at also Jira, and eventually if somebody needs to close out the Jira or like plan the work according to what's in there as well, it's in there.
Okay, cool. On that note, we need to also capture these ones. So I'm just going to add some extra possible discussion points. So on it, just so you know, I required that a GitHub issue is created to discuss generic constraints and is added to the GA milestone. If you all recall, we have this GA milestone that it's basically a bunch of stuff that gets captured and we have to close on it before we do the release. Okay.
Yep, I saw that.
Nifty. All right, we need to define what it means to force install an operator. I think we use this force term a lot. And I don't think everyone's reached a consensus on what that's going to mean. So I just want to before we start trying to support it as a constraint, I want to have a definition of what it means to force install an operator. I think, and I just want to capture some ability to ignore. So my understanding is, as of right now, we're kind of going down a path where we don't consider dependencies. This seems like something we need to consider once we introduce dependencies. What's the best way to track this? Maybe if dependencies are enabled, users to I'm just going to add a note that this is
So here's a clarification question. It sounds like we are saying, okay, if dependencies, I want to install a bundle without worrying about installing the dependencies and other stuff. Isn't that just creating a Ruckpack bundle CRD?
It could be, but right now what we're really getting, what I think this is meant to capture is I have an operator foo, and it depends on bar. how can I install this? How can I install foo without installing bar? And today, we don't even do that. Like if you create an operator CR for operator foo, it's just going to install foo. We don't get operator bar. So we don't need to worry about this problem until we have some automated dependency installation story worked out. At which point, people are like, well, I use the automated dependency install feature, but I don't want to do it for this one case. And it's very difficult for us to say how users are going to opt out of that when we don't even know what that looks like in this new model or how they opt into it. Because it just opens a whole bunch of questions. And so I don't want to even think about this until we start thinking about like, until we start actually like day zero where we are right now, we may get like a notification that we need to install this dependency if we want this, or that this operator foo requires or depends on operator bar, but we don't, as far as I'm concerned, we don't install that today, so we don't need to worry about this one yet.
Yeah, I think there's some conflation of what we mean with force. So there's a force function to say, I don't care about dependencies, I just want to have this operator. That's kind of one scenario. The other scenario, I guess, is I want to have this version. I don't care about your update path. So that's maybe another scenario. And it might become easier to think about this if these were two different spec properties, you know. The other forcing function is like, I don't know, any kind of pre-flight checks that might fail, right? Which might end up being constraints as well. You know, I don't care about these, you know, just go and create the CRD. So I guess Anik was not that far off with his suggestion that, you know, I don't care about the world. Here's the name of a channel. Here's the name of an operator. Go make it happen. But the scenarios where this comes from are different. It's dependencies. It's version selection, I think, and maybe a couple of other scenarios. So maybe it comes from the fact that we all thought, oh, there's spec.force, and if we set that to true, you know, everything is off in terms of sanity checks. So.
Right. So the reason that it popped up at me is because we were thinking in Visor about, you know, these force apply options, because there were knobs already built in that, for example, the Red Hat add-on operators or some of the pipelines that were testing their operators could not, or the SRE team could not escape. So we had, and they had like cascading effects in all of their clusters, which is why we came up with a lot of, you know, escape hatches in the form of force apply or force install. But then in V1, if we have mechanisms that says, okay, here's how you install a bundle. It's a simple Ruckpack bundle CRD with that you mentioned with your bundle image, and here's how you, and the bundle gets installed. That is equivalent of, I don't care about dependencies and I don't care about constraints or anything of that. Just install this for me. Then why do we have to think about also putting that force option in the operator API? You know, so what I'm saying is it's not clear to me where this request or how this request is coming about.
I think it's really important to recognize, and this is actually a discussion that I was just having with Joe and Todd and a few other folks earlier this week, but like, I don't think that there should be a singular -- force, and that's the only thing that you get. Because you're right, in that sense, you could probably just go create some bundled deployments and then be done with it. I kind of think that we want to have several different knobs here, right? Like maybe you're running into an issue where there's a dependency conflict, but you actually know that that dependency conflict's not real, because even though the thing says it supports only one version, it actually can support the one before that and the one after it too. So you could add a flag into the spec of the operator API that says ignore deps, and then it'll install regardless of the dependency constraints. But then separately, we might want to be able to, say, oh, hey, yeah, I know the upgrade for the previous version is failing, or, oh, hey, yeah, I know that there's a CRD migration or CR migration conflict here. I don't care. I want you to ignore that. Just install my thing because my production cluster is down and I need the next version to just be applied. Like those are very different situations. And I think that probably what we want to do is explore the different levels of what constraints do we need to pull out of the resolver, or potentially do we need to have an option to just completely ignore the resolver, pick this one very specific bundle, and have those as different levels of force, if that makes sense, because they're just different requirements, I think.
At least for the first example that you mentioned about bundle dependencies that are, but I know that even the previous version of the next version is supported, so just install that, or I'll install that manually. That kind of problem sounds like you go solve in your catalog building pipeline by rebuilding the bundle to specify that in the FBC. Regarding your second example, I think I didn't clearly get exactly what the scenario is, but at least it sounds like we need to first ask the question, do we need a force install, and why we need a what are the scenarios where the force install could be used? Besides,
So,
I think go ahead, Alex. Sorry.
I just want to jump in. This is why I think it's really important. Like, I don't think we're ever going to land on what a definition for a force install and operator or all the needs in this call. Like, this is really why I wanted to call this out, like start a GitHub discussion to define what it means to force install an operator. Onyx point that you can use like the underlying Ruckpack controller in order to directly install exactly what you need. Yes, that does satisfy super experienced admin users like SRE, but there's a whole, like the whole reason our project exists is to provide admins that aren't living and breathing operators, aren't living and breathing expanding the Kubernetes API, so that they can manage this stuff. And if they get into a scenario where they're saying, OLM's not letting me do this thing that I want to do, and I know that I'm right, we need to consider what those scenarios are going to look like, because I don't know that I always trust them doing bundle deployment, creation and application themselves. They could very much, like, that is not the workflow that we want those users going through and using OLM. It also, or V1, the operator controller. This also would, if we're going to support that workflow and say, like, yes, you should use this and the operator controller, we have to consider what's happening when users are going off and creating operator bundles for CRDs and GVKs that the operator controller may not know about or have created or own. And so the more we push people into this disconnected, just use both the APIs, the more edge cases that we have to consider that aren't even on our radar yet. And so what I really like to see us do is, like, maybe we can expand ticket 5 to say, to define some users that we want to consider, like, when would these people use a force? What is their path for going forward to get out of these different scenarios? And then we can actually land on a single definition of what force is. And like Kevin alluded to, I think that's going to mean having probably a number of knobs so that we can do what the cluster admin wants us to do.
But it sounds like it's design wrong, right? It doesn't seem like in milestone 1 or milestone 2 we will have any functionality where force would actually be useful.
Yeah, and 2, that's why it's like lower on the list, right? Right now we've got a whole bunch of proposed stuff that could be in milestone 2. The end plan is to, order this list and then just pick create a user story off the ones that make the most sense to do now. But then we have a bunch of suggestions that make sense for milestone 3. Because, like, let's say we just kept it, like, these were the 2 most important things, we make the story around it. Milestone 3, suddenly we have a ton of suggestions that get us, that we said were like pretty high priority or things that we thought we might want to work on next. many of those things are probably going to still make sense to work on for milestone 3, and there might be new stuff, and we'll review them when they come up. Does that make sense, Daniel?
Totally reasonable.
Okie dokie. So for this, lead discussion. On what it means. So on it, some of the stuff, consider different user personas. This would be like a SRE user, cluster admin. On it, what other do you, so on it, one of your main concerns, it seemed, was who needs this thing, and I'm thinking the SRE user you mentioned, and then the cluster admin user that I mentioned. Are there any
Yeah.
other user personas?
Not that I can think of right now, but at least, I mean, that point gets us to a stage where while you're leading this discussion for force install, start with what are the personas that'll require or use these, and come to the definition via that method. I think that's good enough. If you think about more personas, we can add them when we are leading this discussion.
And then SRE user, I don't think anyone outside of Red Hat knows what that means. What we're talking about is it's like a super cluster admin that's managing other customer clusters, right? Like multi-tenant cluster. Is there an official term for somebody like that? Does anyone know this term?
I mean, everybody have SREs, but our SREs probably have a different role in terms of our different job expectations, I guess. Managed cluster. I don't know if we have to be any more generic than SREs. SRE is managing multiple clusters.
We'll call it
SRE
super super cluster admin, comfortable with deploying bundle, right? So that's a mouthful. I'm just going to leave it like that because it captures the intent.
Okay.
Okay, cool. So I think this covers the two things we were really interested in getting, the considering different user personas, and then possibly like what all are all of the different forced install scenarios. Does this seem reasonable?
Yep.
Okie dokie. This was good. Okay, and then I honestly think 5 and 6 are gonna probably merge together at some point, but I'm gonna leave them separate for now. Oh, here's a new one. Supporting direct bundle image references in the operator API. Is Joe in
That's
this
going to
here?
be pretty cool. I think. I think that's going to enable a lot more experimental usage because it alleviates the need to have a catalog.
Yeah, it honestly seems like a great project for somebody who's just getting into it. You know, like it's a great, it's a great opportunity for someone just to jump in and create something cool. Because I don't think this is going to be as once this is designed, I don't think implementation should be too crazy because RuckPack already supports bundle image references.
Yeah, the only discussion that will need to be had is this will likely disable most of the other constraints, right? In the system that you specify, if not all of them. So,
Sorry, could you repeat that? I can hear you.
I was saying that this is probably gonna be an interesting discussion because it will completely bypass everything we have discussed so far in this call about constraints and force and whatnot. If you just specify a bundle, none of these constraints about channels, version ranges don't make any sense anymore. This is all only useful in the catalog scenario. So this thing would probably be the most basic example of the operator API. You know, like one liner in the spec section, bundle location. Cool.
Yeah, how does this work with operator? Yeah, I imagine that you'd have to consider it as part of the solution set and make sure that there's not like multiple GVK providers, but you know, that's a question for another day. We don't need to design that now. It's probably too big. We kind of talked about this one. This is like this is kind of part of the release story. Joe, is Joe here?
He's not.
Okay. Maybe we can I'll tag him and repost this at Joe. I think this, does anyone remember if this is a, is this referencing the how to distribute everything once it's all like released, or is this saying that like, hey, I've deployed the 3 components, but I want to upgrade one of the components to a different version?
I don't think anyone in the call have that context.
Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine that it's about anything else, but I don't know that I want to put words in Joe's mouth.
Yeah.
So I think it's worth asking.
Okay, so is this speaking about how to distribute versions? Oh, static version of OLM1. Okay. So it is now 1:01, so we're past our time. Is there anything that anybody wants to talk about before we end for today?
What do you think of the comment that Per made further down below the thread? Deadly performance.
So I think actually discussing that at length is probably better suited for the next meeting, but I'm happy to make a note to start by reviewing that one next week. At a glance, I think if we can get some basic performance tests into the DEPI framework so that we can identify when resolution is slow and hopefully track its performance over time, that could be very, very empowering for us as users that rely on that component. But I think we're gonna, if we
cool.
go into the oh, sorry. Cool. So I'm gonna make a note. Oh, Onik just, it's 401. Sorry, it's 101 and where I am. I'm on the West Coast. Okay, so this is going to be the next meeting, which will be a week from now, which if we look at this, it's going to be the 19th. Topics. Discuss. Okay, I think this will be like, whoop. There we go. Okay. All right, everybody. Thank you again for joining us today. I'm really excited to see us start nailing down some suggestions for milestone 2. I'm sorry that this is slower than we probably want it to go, but I think it's really good to get all this work kind of defined in terms of like what's next on the board. And it's really nice having this ticket to point people that are interested in getting into the project and to say, hey, we are actively triaging what we want to have in the next milestone. Some of this stuff might make it into milestone 2, and the other stuff could be good candidates for milestone 3. So I really appreciate the effort that you're all making to do this. On that note, I'm going to let you all go, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.
Yeah, Alex.
Thanks, Alex.